And we're back. And again, this is the Catholic Lady, and we are reading Great Mind of God by Taylor Caldwell. This is chapter 17, part 2. And Reb Isaac had just sent a letter to Aristo to ask him to check on Hillel ben Baruch because of his fears that he was suicidal. So we will continue here and go on. Aristo was in his flourishing and far-flung olive groves when a slave, he owned 14 now, brought him Reb Isaac's letter. He read it with incredulity, standing there in the chill, thin autumn light of early morning. It was a very mysterious letter. The rabbi wrote with stiff formality and obscurity. Hillel ben Baruch was in sad spirits. His mind was dark with melancholy. Some affliction had been cast over his soul. As if I did not know that, thought Aristo. The rabbi continued that it would please him. Ha! Said Aristo aloud with a wry smile. If Aristo would go to the house of the noble Hillel ben Baruch that evening and converse with him and give him cheer. The letter was the first indication that Reb Isaac had even been aware of Aristo's existence, for never had they exchanged a single word or greeting, or even met eye to eye, or had acknowledged the other's presence. How he must have writhed to bring himself to this pass, thought Aristo, with considerable amusement. He contemplated the proud old man, painfully writing the letter to a former slave. Thus he was more amused. Then he stopped smiling. He sat down on the dry grass and stared at the sheep which wandered through the groves in his eternal symbiosis with the olive trees, and reflected. A Greek did not consider death at one's desiring and by one's will either shameful or criminal, nor did Romans, nor Egyptians, nor other sensible people. When a man decided he had had enough of living, or living had become unbearable or dishonorable, his friends and family understood his act, and while they were saddened, they considered his departure a release from what had been afflicting him beyond endurance. Only unthinking animals suffered life at its worst and clung to it, and Jews of a certainty. Aristo shook his head. Jews were beyond comprehension. They considered life sacred, even their own, and even when they were afflicted beyond bearing. But life was not sacred unless it had a purpose and a meaning, and that was placid and enjoyable as possible. Aristotle himself had set the limits on what a man of intellect should be called upon to tolerate in his life. Hillel ben Baruch had set his limits. Why should anyone, even a friend who dearly loved him for his virtues, contradict him? It was an impertinence, a vulgar insult, an intrusion, an outrage. A man knew his own heart, his own capacity for suffering, his own reasons, and only a base barbarian would argue from his ignorance of another man. Then Aristo thought of his loved pupil Saul, and he pursed his lips, frowning. Saul was a Jew, and the thoughts of Jews were strange and not to be understood. Saul would not agree with either Aristotle or his old teacher, and he had the deepest affection for his father, whom he had never comprehended in the least. Why can they not let him go in peace and wish him a safe harbor? Aristo asked himself. And Aristo asked himself and ran his lean hands over his bristling hair, which was now as gray as ashes. Then he rubbed his palms over his bony knees. shook grass from his garments, and rose, a tall and agile man, with as lithe as a youth still, though he was older than Hillel ben Baruch. His restless black eyes were still as polished and clear as a young man's, and now they were narrowed with thought. He put his cloak over his shoulders and set out on foot for the house of Hillel ben Baruch. The sun was setting in deep golden light, and the scarlet and tumbled mountains threatened the wide and fertile valley as always, and the river ran in brilliant gilt. Aristo moved rapidly and assuredly along the road, thinking deeply. He had known that Hillel was suffering some ill of the body, or the body in silence, and this had been for so many years. But Aristo had a certain restraint which kept him from inquisitiveness. However, he had visited Hillel often, bringing him some fresh fruit from his own gardens, or some Greek sweetmeats which Hillel had appeared to enjoy, or olives steeped in oil and flavored with garlic and peppers, and other Greek delicacies. Of what had they conversed in the evenings and in the early nights? Hillel's children, or the weather, or some newly discovered work of Philo's? Or had they argued some obscure philosophic thoughts? But of late Hillel would fall into deep, heavy silences, and often Aristo would take his departure, and Hillel would not even be aware of it. Aristo reached Hillel's house and was informed by the overseer of the hall that the master had not returned as yet from his gardens. He led Aristo through the house, and Aristo went into the gardens alone. Here the light was suffused with faint rose and gold, and there was a pungent scent of autumn in the air, blowing from the trees, and the leaves rattled dryly. But the red gravel paths were as neat as always, and the fountains sang their frail little songs, and the white statues, and the white statues postured among late flowering bushes, and the black ornate bridge arched over the pond, writhing with its dragons and serpents, and stood against a deep aureate sky. Aristo squinted and looked about him at the marble benches, which were empty, at the bridge reflecting itself in the green stillness of the wide pool, at the black swans and the absurd Chinese ducks, and the white swans and the peacocks who were ruffling their argus-eyed feathers. Aristo saw no one. He had the thought that Hillel was not here at all. But there was no rustle, no movement, no hail. The Greek waited. He called once or twice, "Master! Master!" His voice echoed emptily in the silence. There was no answer. Aristo hesitated. He advanced further into the garden. There was no sign of Hillel. He came to the bridge, pondering, and he walked up its arch and leaned on its low wall. He looked down into the green water, which was without a ripple. Even the swans did not disturb it. Aristo gave the slightest start. Then he continued to gaze down into the water, which was much lighter than a man's head here, which was much higher than a man's head here, and faintly glittering with the last light. Aristo stood there a long time, seeing, and did not move. Then he said gently, "Go in peace, dear master, and may your God look upon you more kindly than I suspect he will. And may he remember there was no man more virtuous than you, nor more loving, nor more tender, nor more just. May you find in the isles of bliss which you merit what you did not find in life. Farewell." And that is the end of chapter 17. Hillel was done with life, and there he was at the bottom of that pond. And Aristo said goodbye. So sad. We'll stop here and continue with chapter 8, or 18.